North Korean execution of POWs and civilians at Seoul. When North Korean forces captured Seoul in the opening days of the war in late June 1950, they came with lists. This wasn't chaos, it was organized. South Korean police officers, government officials, judges, and anyone associated with the Rhee administration were rounded up systematically and shot, thrown into wells, or hauled away never to be seen again. Political prisoners inside Seodaemun Prison were executed before UN forces had any chance of liberating them. UN observers who arrived in the weeks that followed documented thousands of killings in Seoul alone, and the pattern repeated in every town the NKPA passed through heading south. The targets had been identified in advance, which tells you everything about the intent. This was not soldiers losing control in the heat of battle. It was a deliberate campaign to erase the administrative and political infrastructure of a country before the world had time to react. The Bodo League Massacre. Here's the uncomfortable part. South Korea's worst mass killing of the war was carried out by South Korea. The Bodo League was a re-education program. Former leftists who had registered with the government and were theoretically being rehabilitated. When the North Korean invasion came and the front collapsed, the Rhee government decided these people were a liability. Between June and September 1950, ROK authorities executed somewhere between 60,000 and 200,000 Bodo League members in mass killings across the country, with major sites at Daejeon, Gyeongsan, and dozens of remote hillsides and ravines. American military officers were present. Some took photographs. Those photographs were classified and suppressed for decades. South Korea officially denied the massacres happened for over 50 years until its own Truth and Reconciliation Commission began excavating mass graves and confirming what survivors had always known. The No-Gun Rhee Massacre. Between July 26th and 29th, 1950, soldiers of the U.S. 7th Cavalry Regiment killed an estimated 250 to 300 South Korean civilians sheltering under a railroad bridge near the village of No-Gun Rhee. The refugees had been directed there by American soldiers after aircraft strafed their column on the road. For approximately 3 days, ground troops fired on the people huddled beneath the stone bridge arches, mostly women, children, and the elderly, fleeing the advancing NKPA. Survivors described soldiers maintaining fire while people screamed. The U.S. Army acknowledged the event after an Associated Press investigation in 1999 won a Pulitzer Prize for unearthing it, but concluded no formal kill order had been issued. Veterans who spoke to investigators told a different story. The bridge still stands, the bullet marks are still in the stone. The Hill 303 Massacre. On August 17, 1950, American soldiers from the 5th Cavalry Regiment were found dead on a hillside near Wagwon, hands bound behind their backs with communications wire, shot through the back of the head. All 41 of them. They had been captured by NKPA forces during the grinding defensive battles of the Pusan perimeter, and when UN forces began pressing back, their guards executed them rather than deal with the logistical problem of prisoners. General Walton Walker issued a public statement citing the massacre within days of the bodies being found, and it became one of the defining early examples of what the UN command would characterize as a systematic North Korean policy of executing prisoners. It was not an isolated incident. Similar killings were documented throughout the same period, but Hill 303 had names, wire, and witnesses. The Suncheon Tunnel Massacre. By October 1950, UN forces had broken out of the Pusan perimeter, landed at Incheon, and were pushing north fast. The NKPA was retreating in near collapse, and they had American prisoners with them. On October 20th, approximately 170 US POWs were loaded onto a train heading north. Near Suncheon, groups of them were taken off the train, marched to a railroad tunnel, and shot. Some men played dead. A handful survived. The 187th Airborne Regimental Combat Team reached the area shortly after and recovered the survivors, along with evidence of what had happened. Around 66 to 68 men died in and around the tunnel. The logic, if you can call it that, was coldly practical. The guards didn't want to be captured with American prisoners, and they didn't want to let the prisoners go. So they solved the problem. The Suncheon Massacre. The Suncheon Massacre is one of the most disputed events of the entire war. North Korea claims that U.S. forces massacred approximately 35,000 civilians in Hwanghae province during the brief UN occupation of October to December 1950, and they built a museum about it that remains open today as a central piece of DPRK historical memory. Western historians, including Bruce Cummings, have examined the evidence and concluded that mass killings did occur in the area, but that they were carried out largely by Korean factions, anti-communist and pro-communist civilians, brutalizing each other during a power vacuum, not by American soldiers conducting a deliberate massacre. Mass graves are confirmed. The death toll was real. Who pulled the triggers and on whose orders is where the historical record fractures along lines that neither side has much incentive to straighten out. Chinese and NKPA treatment of POWs during the winter advance. When China entered the war in November 1950 and UN forces collapsed into a desperate retreat in temperatures dropping to minus 30 degrees Celsius. And below, thousands of American and Allied prisoners were taken. What followed for many of them was a march northward that killed men as efficiently as combat. The Tiger Death March, named for the NKPA officer in command, Major Pak Sang-hyung, known to prisoners simply as the Tiger, began with 758 prisoners and ended with roughly 296 of them dead, killed by the cold, by starvation, by execution when they fell behind, and their guards decided they were no longer worth the effort. Pak was later tried in absentia for war crimes. The march lasted weeks through mountain passes in the Korean winter, with no shelter, near zero food, and the explicit understanding that stopping meant dying. U.S. napalm bombing of civilian areas. The U.S. Air Force used napalm extensively throughout the Korean War, and by 1952, virtually every significant city in North Korea had been destroyed. Pyongyang was bombed so thoroughly that USAF planners reported running out of meaningful targets. General Curtis LeMay later estimated that the air campaign killed approximately 20% of North Korea's entire population, though that figure encompasses all causes of wartime death and remains difficult to verify precisely. What is documented is the scale. The U.S. dropped more tonnage of bombs on Korea than it had in the entire Pacific theater of World War II, according to figures cited by multiple military historians, though this specific comparison requires careful sourcing. The destruction of civilian infrastructure, dams, irrigation systems, cities, caused famine conditions that killed people long after the bombs stopped falling. Whether this constitutes a war crime under the laws then in force is debated, but the civilian death toll was enormous and deliberate in its targeting logic. POW camp atrocities in North Korean and Chinese-run camps. The permanent prisoner of war camps established along the Yalu River after the front lines stabilized in 1951 were places where approximately 40% of American prisoners died, a death rate dramatically higher than U.S. POW camps in German hands during the World War II. Of roughly 7,140 American POWs, around 2,730 died in captivity from starvation, exposure, disease, and in some cases, direct violence. Prisoners who resisted the mandatory political indoctrination sessions were designated reactionaries and subjected to isolation, beatings, stress positions, and sleep deprivation. The camps also became production facilities for false confessions, including signed statements from U.S. airmen claiming America had conducted biological warfare. Those confessions, extracted under conditions that would satisfy any definition of torture, were broadcast internationally and are still referenced in North Korean state media today. The Kojedo POW camp riots and killings. In May 1952, prisoners at the UN-run Kojedo camp on an island off the southern coast of Korea pulled off something that still seems almost impossible. They captured an American general. Brigadier General Francis Dodd was seized and held hostage for 78 hours while North Korean and Chinese prisoners who had organized themselves into a parallel command structure inside the wire negotiated with UN authorities. Inside the compounds, prisoners who cooperated with UN administrators were killed by their fellow inmates. When UN forces moved in to restore order, they used tear gas, concussion grenades, and eventually tanks, killing approximately 85 prisoners in the crackdown. Dodd was demoted. The incident was a propaganda disaster for the United Nations and a demonstration that the brutality of this war was not confined to one side of the front line. Allegations of U.S. biological warfare. In 1951 and 1952, North Korea and China accused the United States of dropping plague-carrying insects, anthrax, and other biological agents over North Korean and Chinese territory. The International Scientific Commission, led by British scientist Joseph Needham, investigated and produced a report in 1952 concluding the allegations had merit. The U.S. denied everything. 36 American airmen signed confessions admitting to participating in biological warfare operations, and then, after repatriation, recanted everyone, stating the confessions had been produced under torture and prolonged psychological pressure. Declassified Soviet documents examined decades later suggested the entire campaign may have been a coordinated disinformation operation. This remains one of the most genuinely unresolved historical questions of the war, with serious scholars on both sides of the argument, and the truth is probably somewhere that neither Washington nor Beijing has any interest in finding. ROK Army atrocities during counteroffensives. As ROK forces recaptured territory throughout 1950 and 1951, they moved through areas that had lived under NKPA occupation for weeks or months. What followed in many of those towns was summary execution of suspected collaborators, of people denounced by neighbors, of anyone whose name appeared on a list, or whose face was recognized by the wrong person at the wrong moment. U.S. advisors attached to ROK units documented incidents and in some cases reported them up the chain of command without any recorded consequence. South Korea's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, operating from 2005 onward, documented hundreds of individual incidents, including the Goyeong-gumjeong cave massacre, where at least 153 civilians were killed. The TRC's findings were initially resisted by the South Korean government before eventually being accepted as part of the official historical record. Forced repatriation, dispute, and violence at armistice. The armistice negotiations that began in July 1951 deadlocked for approximately 18 months, largely over a single question. Could prisoners of war refuse to go home? Around 22,000 North Korean and Chinese prisoners said they would not return. North Korea and China insisted all prisoners must be repatriated under the Geneva Conventions. The U.S. insisted on voluntary repatriation. To determine which prisoners wanted to go back and which didn't, UN forces conducted screenings inside the camps, which turned violent repeatedly, as prisoner factions used intimidation and killing to prevent defections, and camp authorities used force to maintain order. Dozens of prisoners died in these riots. The stalemate extended the war by an estimated 18 months, meaning the casualties produced by that delay, on all sides, dwarfed the number of prisoners whose fate was being decided. The armistice was finally signed on July 27, 1953. The Gyeochang and Hamyang massacres. In February 1951, soldiers of the ROK 11th Division operating in South Gyeongsang Province herded villagers into ravines and open fields and shot them. The victims at Gyeochang numbered approximately 719. At Hamyang, approximately 385 more were killed. The soldiers filed reports describing the dead as communist guerrillas killed in combat. The truth came out within weeks when a South Korean National Assembly investigation exposed what had actually happened. One of the rare moments in this war when accountability moved faster than the usual decades-long delay. Colonel Han Dong-suk was court-martialed and sentenced to death, a sentence later commuted. The Gyeochang and Hamyang massacres are unusual not because they were worse than other atrocities committed during the war, but because they were investigated, documented, and prosecuted at the time, which by the standards of the Korean War made them almost exceptional. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.